Well, all right, let's have a seat. Well, normally I would say tonight, let's open up our Bibles to where are we at? Numbers 14. But I'll be saying that a week from today. All right. So tonight we have Tom Weinraub and his wife Sue with us, and Tom is going to be sharing with us about the miracle of Israel. And I have always said that if there is no God, then you're going to have to explain Israel, right? And of course, as we've been going through the book of Numbers, the fact that they even made it that far was a miracle, right? And so the fact that they still remain today and God has an eternal plan for them. And we have been grafted into them, right? You've got that whole replacement theology business going on out there. There's no replacement. We've been grafted into them. And so we should have a very high view of the nation of Israel and God's eternal promises to them. And so, Tom, would you please come and share with us?
All right. Thank you. All right. You hear me okay? All right. Yes. Shalom Aleichem, brothers and sisters in Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, and good evening. I want to begin by thanking Pastor Paul for inviting me to speak to you on the miracle called Israel. Shalom Aleichem is a Hebrew expression, comes from the book of John, chapter 14 and verse 27, where Jesus says, "My peace I give you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, and neither let it be afraid." I grew up in Fort Wayne in a Jewish home and into the Jewish community. And for the first 22 years of my life, I attended the Jewish Reformed Temple, where my picture still hangs on its wall, along with my confirmation class. I became a born-again believer in Yeshua, which is the Hebrew way of saying Jesus, when I was 22 years old. We live in such miraculous times. Sadly, so few have a clue. Only God knows the beginning from the end and knows all things. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, once said, "If you live in Israel and you're a realist, then you have to believe in miracles." Webster's dictionary defines a miracle as an extraordinary event taken as a sign of the power, the supernatural power of God. The rebirth of the state of Israel on May 14, 1948 is a modern-day miracle. Never before in the history of the world has any nation been so utterly destroyed. Its people scattered to the four corners of the world for 2 millennia. Its people so utterly devoid of hope and then regathered back to their homeland. Never before, that is, except for Israel. It goes against all odds. And they keep coming from the 120 countries of the world. In my opinion, the regathering of the Jews from the four corners of the world is a miracle greater than their deliverance from Egyptian captivity. Does anyone here know the name of the commander of the Israeli military? And I'll give you a hint. He does not lose. Yahweh Sabaoth, God. My 9-year-old came up with that one, but grandson. 70 years ago, the nation of Israel was born in a day. Zion gave birth to her children. Isaiah 66:8 says, "Who has ever heard of such a thing? Who has ever seen such a thing? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children." God is not through with his chosen people. Great things lie ahead, along with many trials and tribulations. In November of 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which said His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a homeland in Palestine for the Jews. Well, it was never enacted. And by the way, I prefer to use the name Israel and not Palestine, since Israel was a name given by God to the Old Testament patriarch Jacob after Jacob wrestled with the pre-incarnate Jesus in the wilderness. This was a theophany or Christophany, or visible appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. The name Israel means one who wrestles or struggles with God. Over 300 years ago, the King of France asked a great Christian philosopher, Blaise Pascal, to give him proof of the existence of God. Pascal responded, "Why, the Jews, Your Majesty, the Jews. There are no more Jebusites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, or termites. Well, maybe some termites. Yeah, let me stop here for a minute and give you my DNA story, if you don't mind. All right? For Christmas, my daughter bought me a DNA kit with 23andMe. So I took it, took 3 months to get the results. They came back, and I let her look at them first. She looks down, she looks up at me, and she says, "You're 99.9% Jewish." I said, "That's great, but where's the other 0.1%? And my wife, who I've known for 50 years to be 100% Italian, turns out to be 86.4% Italian. But the good news is she's 0.1% Jewish, so we're complete, right? My lesson for today is about the modern state of Israel and the miracles, the literal miracles God has done from its conception on May 14th, 1948 to its preservation at this present time. And I want you to know from the outset that I'm going to be speaking from a bias, so please interpret all my thoughts in that light. I submit to you that bias is a good word and prejudice is a bad word. Prejudice is to prejudge, and bias can come from an honest evaluation of the facts as they really exist. Pastor teacher John MacArthur once said, "If you get Israel right, you get your eschatology right." Eschatology is a fancy word for things that come last, and it goes without saying that if you don't get Israel right, then your eschatology is confused and you won't have a proper understanding of what lies ahead. Getting Israel right means understanding what God has done and will do for her in the future. I believe that Israel is God's timepiece and the Jewish people are God's second hand. If you want to know where we are eschatologically or prophetically in the world today, keep your eyes on Israel and the Jewish people. I believe that God's prophetic time clock began to tick when on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, stood up on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in Tel Aviv, in Israel's largest city, and announced to the entire world that Israel is now a nation among nations. Immediately, the 5 major Arab countries surrounding Israel said to Israel, "If you declare yourself to be a nation, we'll drive you into the Mediterranean Sea in 1 week." Well, the following day, on May 15th, 1948, the Jews fought their war of independence against approximately 80 million Arabs with relatively good government, good military hardware, good financing or treasury, Russian technology, up against perhaps 650,000 Jews with no government, no military hardware, no financing or treasury, most of them coming out of World War II Nazi Germany, where they lost their entire family members to the death camps and concentration camps of the Holocaust. So it's ironic. Now, you tell me, who is fighting who? Who is attacking whom? 80 million Arabs against 650,000 Jews. Talk about David and Goliath, it would pale by comparison. I believe that God's prophetic time clock kicked into high gear when in June of 1967, the Jews fought the Six-Day War. And in 6 days, the Jews took from Jordan East Jerusalem. East and West Jerusalem became one under Israeli command for the first time since 70 AD, when the Roman general Titus and his Roman legions marched into Jerusalem. They destroyed the city, they destroyed the temple and its altar, and they killed approximately 1.1 million Jewish people in a type of Holocaust. The Jews were scattered to the 4 corners of the world in what became known as the diaspora, only to come out of the diaspora, to make aliyah. Aliyah is Hebrew, it means to come up to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. I want to continue with this discussion, the miracle called Israel, by looking at the war years of 1935, 36, and 37, and Adolf Hitler is making his ascendancy to power in Nazi Germany. And where the Germans are marching, the Jews are getting out. And they're sailing in antiquated pre-World War I type vessels, and they're sailing to Australia. And Australia says, "Sorry, we have our immigration quotas in place. We only take so many people from that part of the world. Go back to your port of embarkation." So the Jews sail to Canada, hear the same thing. The United States, they hear the same thing. And finally, the Jews sail across the Mediterranean Sea to Israel, or at the time it was known as Palestine. And Great Britain, who had taken this land from the Ottoman Turks, who held it for 400 years, came out with the white papers, which says only 1,500 Jews per month could enter into the land of Israel. So why did Great Britain do this? Were they particularly vindictive? The answer is no. It was 1938, the writing was on the wall. World War II was about to take place, and Great Britain wanted the Arabs to fight alongside the British against the Germans in World War II, just as they did in World War I. After all, oil's a factor. There's only a handful of Jews in the area. So Great Britain comes up with the white papers restricting immigration into Israel to only 1,500 Jews per month. This was less than a drop in the ocean in the amount of Jews fleeing for their very lives trying to get in any country that would take them. World War II comes along, and the Jews felt that they had a far worse enemy in the Nazis than they did in the British, so the Jews fight alongside the Allies against the Germans in World War II. It's the end of World War II. Most Jews have lost everything: mothers, brothers, cousins, sisters. Many times they're the only surviving member of their family. And again, the Jews are setting sail across the Mediterranean Sea to Israel. And in 1947, at the height of this, Great Britain, with 100,000 men stationed in Israel, an armada of ships stationed there, the white paper still in force, as these Jewish vessels get within 3 miles of the land of Israel, Great Britain sends a Navy destroyer out to meet it and send it back to its port of embarkation, or they intern them on the island of Cyprus, where they allow only 1,500 Jews per month to enter in, until one day a ship comes along called the Exodus, and it's loaded with passengers, half starving, coming out of Nazi Germany. Now, you might remember the movie called The Exodus. It's 4 hours long. I do recommend it. It stars Paul Newman, who happens to be half Jewish, so don't say there aren't any good-looking Jewish guys out there. We all look like Jerry Lewis, except for me. You know. I think I'm more Dustin Hoffman when I was 21. My wife says I wish. So, in the story of the Exodus, the captain of the British destroyer says to the captain of the Exodus, "Go back." And the captain of the Exodus says, "We're not going back." So the captain of the British destroyer says, "Then we're going to board you." And the captain of the Exodus says, "If you board us, we're going to blow this ship up with men, women, and children right in front of the whole world to see." Remember, the world's sympathy is with this ship. The Jews have just lost 6 million souls in the Holocaust. So the captain of the British destroyer says to the captain of the Exodus, "Then we're going to wait here until you leave." And the captain of the Exodus responds, "We're not only not going to leave, we're not going to eat." And as they were already half starving, they went on a hunger strike. And as they died, they simply threw the bodies overboard for the whole world to see. Great Britain goes back to the United Nations and says, "You gave us this land in the mandate of 1922. We're giving it back to you. Take it back. Do what you want. We don't care." It took Great Britain 6 months to pull out of Israel, and they did so very unevenly, where in every way they could, they favored the Palestinian population, and in every way they could, they harassed the Jewish population. The British would go into the Jewish kibbutzes or farm communities, launch surprise attack, confiscate the Jews' military equipment. So because of the way the British mistreated the Jews, Great Britain, one of the most powerful countries the world has ever known, it was said of Great Britain, the sun does not set on any part of the British Empire, within 10 years became a third-rate country economically, politically, religiously, morally, spiritually, in every respect, because there's a principle found in the Bible. And it's found in Genesis 12:3, which says, "I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you." Great Britain had a moral and legal obligation to protect the Jews, but because of political expediency, chose not to do so and went down the tubes. Now, this verse in Genesis 12:3 applies to individuals, nations, churches, everyone. If you want to be blessed by God, bless the Jewish people. And conversely, if you want to be cursed by God, then you will be cursed. And by the way, wouldn't you want to be on the same side God is on? The United Nations comes along and decides it's going to partition half of Israel for a Palestinian state and half for a Jewish state. Remember, 80% of Israel is already gone. It formed the nation of Jordan, or Transjordan. That left 20% left. The Arabs said, "We're not going to take it. We don't even recognize the Jews' right to exist." The Jewish people said, "That's not what we expect in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, but it's better than nothing. We'll take it." So Israel knows they're about to go to war. Most countries in the world will not sell the Jews military equipment. The ones that would be pre-World War I dilapidated stuff. Israel says, it's better than nothing, but they need the money to buy it with. So Israel sends Golda Meir to America in the hope that she can collect a sum of $10 or $12 million from Jews and Jewish sympathizers. Golda was born in Russia. She came to America as a young girl. She became a U.S. citizen, went to public school in Milwaukee, taught public school in Milwaukee, but as a young woman, she made Aliyah, goes back to Israel, and becomes part of their political process. So here comes Golda to New York City. The first day she gets off the plane, she collects a sum of $10 or $12 million. Within 2 weeks, she collected $50 million, money the Jews badly needed to buy military equipment. Well, it's one thing to be a nation on paper, and another thing to be a nation in reality. The Jews needed the recognition of major world powers. And the world power the Jews were concerned with in 1947 was the United States. And the president of the United States in 1947 was the guy that says the buck stops here by his name, Harry S. Truman. And by the way, do you know what the S stands for? It doesn't stand for anything. In 1947, Harry was listening to his advisors and generals in State Department that were saying, do not vote for Israel to become a nation. It wasn't that they weren't sympathetic. It's that Israel be driven into the sea. She'd come out stillborn. The U.S. should be making a political and diplomatic blunder. However, due to the providence of God, it turned out that Harry's best friend was a Jewish guy by the name of Eddie Jacobson from Harry's hometown of Independence, Missouri. On May 12, 1948, just 2 days before the Jews were to make their Declaration of Independence, his best friend comes to the nation's capital from Missouri, enters into the presence of the President of the United States of America, and says to his old friend Harry, I've never asked anything from you before, but I'm asking you now, give my people a chance. And Harry said, yes. And our country's been blessed in ways we'll never know till we get to heaven for 2 reasons. Number 1, we've given the Jews a homeland like no other country in the world. And number 2, we've sent missionaries to the 4 corners of the world. I would now like to read a small portion from the movie called The Miracle of Israel. I do recommend you get it. It's narrated by Leonard Nimoy, a.k.a. Spock. Before I go on, I want to give you a little story, if you don't mind, about Spock, or Leonard. His parents and grandparents were Jewish. They came from the Ukraine. My grandparents came from the Ukraine. And Leonard would often visit his grandfather's very Orthodox synagogue in Boston. And there the men would be segregated from the women, and the men would wear their prayer shawls, and they'd be moving back and forth as they recited their prayers. At the end of the ceremony, the rabbi would hold his hands up to do the Aaronic benediction from Numbers chapter 6. And he'd hold his hands up in the form of the Hebrew letter, the 21st letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Shin, S-H-I-N. It looks like our English W. Now, I don't have the manual dexterity to do that. Perhaps you can, well, you might be Jewish. Who knows, right? Find out when you get to heaven. The first letter in Shin is S, which is the first letter in Shaddai, as in God, like in El Shaddai, or Shekinah, the Shekinah glory of God, or Jerusalem, like Jeru, king, or Shalom, peace, king's peace. It's the only city God ever put his name on. So the rabbi would do the Aaronic benediction, and he would say, Yevarechecha Adonai Yishmerecha. And the people would respond, the Lord bless you and keep you. So when Leonard got into the movies to honor the memory of his grandfather, he would, as the Vulcan salute, as Spock, he would say, live long and prosper. Now, I figure if you only remember about 5% of everything I'm telling you, then you're going to remember that. And by the way, this is on YouTube, and I've got a little link to it, so I'm throwing a lot at you, but if you want to see it again, it's on YouTube. On May 14th, 1948, as David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and 350 others gathered in Tel Aviv, it was about 10 a.m. in our nation's capital. The day the British mandate over the Holy Land expired, Jewish People's Council gathered to declare the establishment of the State of Israel. On that same afternoon, several Israeli council members met to approve the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. But just hours before it would be read, the new state still did not have a name. Historical names like Zion and Judea were proposed and rejected. It was David Ben-Gurion who said the name would simply be Israel. After signing the Declaration of Independence on May 14, 1948, the very next day, 5 major Arab countries attacked. Egypt sends an armada of ships across the Mediterranean Sea, ready to level Israel's largest city, Tel Aviv. The Jews have no guns, no planes, no tanks. They have no way to defend themselves. But they do locate a little Piper Cub plane and two young men. One young man gets in to be the pilot. The other young man gets in to be the bombardier. And they fly very low over this armada of ships and they drop their bombs. On the last pass, they dropped the last bomb on the largest ship in the armada, did terrible damage to that ship, and the entire armada of Egyptian ships turned around and went home. In the process, the two young men flew so low that they died. One of the fathers of these two young men, as fate would have it, became one of the first decipherers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the other father became one of the first members of the Israeli Knesset, or Congress. Egypt sends a force of 2,500 soldiers across the Suez Canal into the Sinai. It was to be a two-pronged attack. One part of the force was to go along the Mediterranean into Tel Aviv and link up with Iraqi and Syrian tanks coming down from the north, and the other part was to go into West Jerusalem and attack the Jews there. This force of 2,500 Egyptians was fully loaded with tanks, half-tracks, Messerschmitt planes, you name it. Up against them was a force of 150 Jews made up of half farmers, half soldiers with very little military equipment. And somehow this force of 150 Jews stopped this force of 2,500 Egyptians from going any further for 6 months, long enough for the guy with the patch, Moshe Dayan. He was an officer in the British Army. He used some of the money Golda had got, bought some four-wheel drive Jeeps, loaded some machine guns on those Jeeps, and routed the Egyptians back across the Suez Canal. In the north, Iraqi and Syrian tanks are banding together, and their purpose was to take the Galilee, and after taking the Galilee, they would go into Haifa and effectively cut Israel in half. At the southern end of the Sea of Galilee by Tiberias was a little farm community or kibbutz called Tiganya. And these people at Tiganya had very little military equipment. I said that one before. And they put some barbed wire around their commune. And as the Iraqi and Syrian tanks came crashing through, the oldest man pled with the rest, keep on fighting on. Well, they had nothing to fight with, but they did have a 16-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl hiding in the underbrush with some homemade bombs, Molotov cocktails. The boy jumps on the first tank, destroys it. That tank is still in Israel today, and the girl did terrible damage to the second tank. And the entire force of Iraqi and Syrian tanks turned around and went home. Now, this was as great a miracle as anything in the Old Testament, and it happened in our lifetime. 1 year later, when the armistice was called, Israel actually had more land than when she first began. Let me continue on with the miracle called Israel by examining some of the incredible miracles of the Six-Day War of 1967. History speaks of the 100-Year War, the 30-Year War, and many other long-fought battles. Here, in a short 6 days in June of 1967, Israel managed to utterly rout not one but four powerful enemies. Even West Point staff do not teach its cadets about this war. According to military strategy and textbook tactics, the Jews should have lost this war. They should have been driven into the dustbin of history. But you and I know that God protects them even through miracles. The staff at West Point understands that God is winning these wars, but God does not fit into military textbooks. There were a multitude of miracles witnessed by the whole world in the Six-Day War of 1967. The state of Israel was born just 3 years after Auschwitz, but the soul of the state of Israel was born 19 years later in 1967 when East and West Jerusalem became one. In this war, Israel would launch a preemptive strike against both Egypt and Syria. Now, Israel does have, and will have a policy of preemptive strike, which means if Israel knew, and in June of 1967, the entire world knew that both Egypt and Syria are about to attack, Israel must strike first. If they don't, it's over. Please understand that the amount of land given to form the nation of Israel in 1947 by the United Nations was smaller in square footage than the state of New Jersey and harder to defend because at one point it was only 9 miles wide. Israel says, our bridge is too narrow. If Goliath strikes first, we're through. So Israel sends its planes out to sea in a direction not picked up by Russian radar, flew very low, dangerously low, under Russian radar, and came back towards the land of Egypt and Syria and destroyed 90% of the planes of Egypt and Syria while they were still on the ground in the first 5 hours of that war. Now, while this is going on, NASA of Egypt is telephoning Hussein of Jordan saying, "We are defeating the Israelis. We're going to drive them into the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to toast our victories on the beaches of Tel Aviv." He was lying. He was trying to bring Jordan into the battle in order to take the heat off of Egypt. Would you believe the Jews actually intercepted and recorded that telephone conversation? General Uzi Narkis, the general for the Jews, who was head of the Central Theater of Command, was under orders not to fire one round, not one shell against the Jordanians. But because of this telephone call, when Jordan attacked, Israel in the counterattack took from Jordan, East Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley, the West Bank, which you know as Judea and Samaria. In the south, the Jews took the Sinai from Egypt, more than twice the size of the nation of Israel, but they gave that back years later to Egypt for peace with Egypt. In the north, the Jews got an area called the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights is a mountainous range that runs from about the Sea of Galilee in Israel all the way up to Mount Hermon or Hermon in modern-day Lebanon, where one the city of refuge was in Old Testament times. It's part of biblical Israel. And from 1948 to 1967, the Syrians were up there shelling Israeli farm communities below. The children lived underground, went to school underground, ate underground. They came out a couple days in a month when there was a lull in the shelling. And from 1948 to 1967, the Syrians were putting in miles and miles of barbed wire behind it, minefields, or miles and miles of barbed wire in minefields and more miles of barbed wire. It was a Russian technique, 3 strands of deterrent. But you know the Jews had a secret weapon? His name was Eli Cohen. Now, how many of you have ever been to Israel? I do recommend you go. It's very safe, very modern. The Bible comes alive, and beside, if you die up there, you're closer to heaven, but what do I know? I'm a little biased, so just... So if you go to Israel, you'll see Eli Cohen Boulevard. Parents named their children after him, and whole neighborhoods immortalize his character. He was the national hero and master spy of Israel. Eli was a Jew. He was born in Egypt. His mother tongue was Egyptian, Arabic. And the Israeli secret police, called the Mossad, like our CIA, took Eli from Egypt and trained him in Israel as a spy. They provided Eli with false documentation and sent him to Argentina, Buenos Aires, as an exporter of fine furniture. Eli lives there for almost 2 years and meets many Syrian businessmen. Then the secret Mossad agents from Israel took Eli from Argentina and sent him to Damascus, Syria, again with false documentation. And Eli builds this magnificent home. He meets many of the businessmen he became friends with in Argentina, along with high political figures and all the generals of the Syrian staff. Even the daughter of the Syrian president falls madly in love with him. He's a spy for the Jews. At his home, Eli throws some magnificent parties and has the most powerful radio transmitter known to that time concealed in his home. By the time the generals have their staff meeting the next day, Eli knows what everything's going on and is contacting Israel with that information. One day, Eli becomes very friendly with the chief of staff of the Syrian army, and he says to his friend, the chief of staff of the Syrian army, "Take me to the Golan Heights." Well, they do. And in front of the generals, he takes out his drawing pads. He asks questions. He sketches in where the tanks are, the troops are, the half-tracks, the pillboxes, sketches it in all over the place. Then he hollows out the leg of a chair, puts the drawings in, sends the table and chairs to Argentina, Buenos Aires, where a secret Mossad agent gets it. And by the time the war breaks out in 1967, the Jews know where everything is because of Eli Cohen. One day, Eli says to his friend, the chief of staff of the Syrian army, "The Jews aren't dummies. Before they attack, they'll send their observation planes over, and they'll see where your tanks are, your troops are, your half-tracks, your pillboxes. Plus, it gets very hot up here. Do one thing that will help you 2 ways. Plant this particular type of tree. It'll give your men shade and hide your military installations from the Israelis." Well, the Syrians do it. And Eli simply wires Israel on this, using this powerful radio transmitter, and said, when you see this particular type of tree, simply shell the tree. There's a Syrian pillbox right next to it. Happened, you know. In 1965, with Eli still living in Damascus, Syria, and his wife and children living in Tel Aviv in Israel, he's contacting his wife and children using this powerful radio transmitter. The Indian government in Syria is trying to get a hold of their government in India, and they run into interference, and they notify the Syrian authorities. The Syrians already know there's a mole or spy somewhere in their organization. So they hone in on Eli's signal from 3 different directions using Egyptian technology and advisors. They capture Eli, and Israel says, give us back Eli Cohen. We'll empty out our prison. 600 or so Syrians can go. Give us back Eli Cohen. And Syria said no, and they hung him upside down in Damascus, Syria, for ridicule and shame. Israel says to Syria, give us back Eli's body. We'll give you $15 million for his body. And Syria said no, and they buried him in an unknown grave somewhere in Damascus, Syria. There's a good movie out about Cohen's life that I would recommend to you. It's called The Impossible Spy. The Impossible Spy. After Israel conquered the Golan Heights from Syria in the Six-Day War of 1967, the world comes to Israel and says, give it back. Israel says, you got to be out of your tree. It's a natural defensible border. Other countries win land in battle. We've lost thousands of men. The answer is no. Then the world comes to Israel and says, give us back the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria. Israel says the Arabs can live there. They can have their own police, their own mayors. They can have their own schools. They can even be autonomous, but it has to be part of the West Bank, has to be part of Israel, because if we simply turn the West Bank over to the Palestinians, the PLO, or Palestine Liberation Organization, will be up against our border within 6 months and put us into an impossible to defend position. So the answer is no. In 1973, Israel would fight the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year for Jewish people. It's the highest of the high holidays in which Jews ask God to forgive them and inscribe their name in God's book of life for one more year. It was a cold day in October of 1973. There were over 200 separate communiques from Israeli Mossad agents from around the world saying, the Arabs are coming, the Arabs are coming. They knew the date, the place, the time. They knew it all. The Israeli government so puffed up with pride because of their victory in 1967 and so worried about world public opinion said, nah, it'll never happen. We'll pulverize them. The government was led by Golda Meir as prime minister and Moshe Dayan as chief of staff. It actually cost Golda her job. So here comes Egypt crossing the Bar-Lev line from the south with 2,500 tanks. The Bar-Lev line was named after an Israeli general supposed to stop the tanks, supposed to be impregnable. The Egyptians crossed that line in less than 2 days due to the element of surprise and overwhelming firepower. In the north along the Golan Heights, Syria is coming with 1,800 tanks. There were less than 600 IDF, Israeli Defense Force soldiers, guarding that border with Syria. The Jews were literally throwing their bodies in front of these tanks that give the Jews time to come out of their temples, synagogues, and shuls. Israel at the time had a small standing army of 150,000 men and women, but they could mobilize 2 million more, but it takes 2 days to do so. Now, before this war began, both Egypt and Syria were putting in SAM 6 and 7 missile sites. Now, if you're old enough, you might remember that in the news back then. So along comes Henry Kissinger and says to the Jews, stop bombing these missile sites. They don't mean you any harm. We're trying to build good relations with the Russians. Quit doing it. So Israel does stop doing it. So in 1973, when the Jews try to use their trump card and send their planes up in the air, they would simply be knocked out of the sky by the SAM 6 and 7 missiles. So here comes Egypt crossing their border with Israel with 2,500 tanks. And for 2 days, they keep moving. They simply keep moving. Here comes Syria crossing the Golan Heights in the north with 1,800 tanks. And for 2 days, they keep moving. They simply keep moving. After 2 days, they stop. They simply stop. It's a Russian policy. You move your tanks, you move your supplies, you stop, you regroup, resupply, bring in reinforcements. Plus, they thought the Jews were trying to set a trap from them from behind. But they simply stopped. If they would have gone 2 more days, they would have destroyed all of Israel, but due to the providence of God, They stopped. Things were going so badly for the Jews in the first 2 days of that war in 1973 that Moshe Dayan comes to Golda Meir with the code words, the third temple's about to be destroyed. It was the code words to arm their nuclear bombs. Israel does have, and will have nuclear bombs. They're called the Samson option. They're to be used only against a country or countries that destroy most of Israel. It was named after the Old Testament judge Samson, who brought down a Philistine temple upon himself along with 3,000 Philistines. So Israel takes out about 14 nuclear bombs, arms them, puts them on the various planes, and sends them to 4 or 5 various airfields around the country in case worse comes to worse. While this is going on, Russian spy satellite sees what Israel is doing by arming their nuclear bombs. So Russia is putting paratroopers on the planes ready to come into the Middle East, along with sending ships armed with nuclear bombs coming to Syria. Now, while this is going on, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger sees what Russia is doing. They unlock our ICBM units, issue a code red, and the world's about to go to World War III. And I know my time's limited. I'll try to move in not 5 minutes or so. Is that okay? Or I'll move as quick as I can. Now, guess what happens next? It involves Richard Nixon. As a young boy growing up, Nixon's Christian Quaker mother told him that one day he would be in a powerful position and a situation would arise when Israel and the Jews needed his help, and when that day arose, he was to help them. It's reported that Nixon heard the voice of his mother saying these words to him when he responded to a call and plea for help from Golda Meir at 3 in the morning. Continuing on with this war of Egypt and Syria, Ariel Sharon, who at the time was the number 2 man in the Israeli command and was a field general, and without orders from above, directs his tanks towards the Egyptian Third Army consisting of 40,000 men. In one of the largest tank battles in all of history, the Egyptians thought Sharon was going to engage him in pitched battle. Instead, Sharon does a surprise maneuver, opens up a corridor 10 miles wide in the Egyptian Third Army. The Jewish tanks come rushing in, surround the Egyptian Third Army, running out of food, water, and supplies. The Egyptians simply gave up. Ariel knocks out the SAM 6 and 7 missile sites, and he's 2 days away from destroying Cairo, Egypt. In the north of Israel, I'm just about to close here, there is a young lieutenant named Steve Greengold in the Israeli Tank Corps. Steve is in civilian clothes. He hears that war broke out. He's 5 miles away from the front lines. In Israel, you can be 5 miles away from the front lines. He hitchhikes to the front lines, asks his commanding officer for a command. They give him his tank and 3 others. They get up along the Golan Heights, find a narrow ravine thought inaccessible to Israeli tanks, climbs it, hits, runs, shoots, hitting, running, shoot. 2 tanks get knocked out. His tank and another back down along the base of the Golan Heights. Again, they get up to this narrow ravine. He keeps hitting, running, shooting. At one point, his tank got knocked out. He got badly burned on the hands and face. He commandeers a passing Israeli tank. He keeps hitting, running, shooting. After 2 days, he falls down before his commanding officer, and he says, "I can do no more." They documented he knocked out 60 Syrian tanks, as great a miracle as anything in the Old Testament, and it gave the Jews time to come out of their temples, synagogues, and shuls, knock out the SAM 6 and 7 missile sites, and they're 2 days away from destroying Damascus, Syria. And that's where I'll stop. There's a lot more. It's on the video. Please watch it. But the whole point I'm trying to make is God loves Israel. God is still in the miracle business. And God is telling Israel and the world, you did not do this, Jews. I did this. God is for Israel. And as I said, if God's for Israel, then we should be as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.